Before history was written by victors, before borders were drawn on maps, we recognize today entire kingdoms rose, flourished and vanished in near silence, leaving behind only whispers in stone fragments, in forgotten manuscripts and mysteries that still puzzle historians, because the story of civilization is not just the story of empires we celebrate, but also of powerful societies that thrived beyond the spotlight and then slipped quietly into obscurity. And in this video, we journey into those hidden worlds to understand how they rose, how they ruled, and why they ultimately fell, revealing patterns that still shape our modern world. The story of hidden kingdoms begins long before the modern idea of a nation-state. In a world where geography determined destiny and survival depended on controlling water, trade routes, and belief systems, because many of these kingdoms did not seek global dominance or leave behind grand monuments meant to intimidate outsiders, but instead focused inward, developing complex cultures, advanced systems of governance, and economic networks that were remarkably sophisticated for their time, yet vulnerable to forces they could not foresee. Archaeological research over the past century has revealed that some of these kingdoms were not small or insignificant at all, but regional powerhouses whose influence rivaled that of Rome, Han China, or the Persian Empire, even if their names were later erased or absorbed into the stories of more aggressive neighbors. In many cases, these societies deliberately avoided expansionist warfare, choosing stability and control over conquest, a strategy that allowed them to prosper for centuries, but also left them exposed when the balance of power shifted. One of the defining features of hidden kingdoms is their relationship with geography, because isolation often served as both their greatest strength and their greatest weakness, as mountain ranges deserts dense forests, and oceans provided natural defenses that protected them from invasion, while simultaneously limiting their ability to adapt to external changes. And historians widely believe this duality explains why so many of these societies remained unknown for so long. In regions like the highlands of Southeast Asia, the jungles of Central America, the Horn of Africa, and the deserts of Central Asia, kingdoms developed unique political structures that differed sharply from the imperial models we tend to focus on, relying on local alliances, ritual authority, and trade diplomacy rather than brute force. These systems worked extraordinarily well in stable conditions, but they often struggled when climate shifts, population pressure, or new military technologies disrupted the equilibrium. Trade was the lifeblood of many hidden kingdoms, and contrary to the idea that they were isolated backwaters, evidence suggests they were deeply embedded in global exchange networks, exporting luxury goods, rare minerals, agricultural products, and cultural ideas across vast distances, sometimes without ever appearing in the written records of their trading partners. Recent archaeological findings suggest that some African and Asian kingdoms maintained trade links with the Mediterranean world, the Indian subcontinent, and even East Asia centuries before European explorers documented such connections. And while the details remain debated, there is growing consensus among historians that global interconnectedness began far earlier than previously assumed. These trade networks brought wealth and innovation, but they also introduced dependency, because when routes shifted due to war, technological change, or political collapse elsewhere, the economic foundations of these kingdoms could crumble with shocking speed. Religion and ideology played a central role in legitimizing power within hidden kingdoms, often blending spiritual authority with political leadership in ways that made rulers appear divinely sanctioned, and in many cases this fusion created remarkable social cohesion, as people saw obedience not merely as a civic duty, but as a sacred obligation. Temples, ritual centers, and ceremonial landscapes were carefully designed to reflect cosmic order, reinforcing the idea that the kingdom itself was a microcosm of the universe, balanced and eternal. This same belief system could become dangerously rigid when confronted with crisis. Scholars note that when environmental disasters, famine, or military defeat occurred, faith in the ruler's divine mandate could collapse rapidly, leading to internal fragmentation that proved more destructive than any external invasion. The rise of hidden kingdoms was often gradual rather than explosive, built on incremental gains in agricultural productivity, administrative efficiency, and social organization. And unlike empires forged through conquest, these societies expanded influence through marriage alliances, tributary relationships, and cultural assimilation. Over generations, this created layers of authority that were deeply embedded in local traditions, making governance remarkably resilient in normal times, but also highly personalized, meaning that the death or failure of a single ruler could destabilize the entire system. Historians studying these patterns often point out that succession crises were a common trigger for decline, as rival factions vied for power, weakening the kingdom from within at the very moment external threats intensified. Climate change, although often overlooked in popular history, appears to have played a decisive role in the fall of many hidden kingdoms, as recent studies using tree rings, ice cores, and sediment analysis suggest periods of prolonged drought, flooding, or temperature shifts coincided with societal collapse across multiple regions. When agricultural systems failed and food shortages became widespread, trade networks strained, rebellions flared, and the legitimacy of ruling elites eroded, creating a cascade of failures that could overwhelm even well-organized states. Some experts argue that adaptability was the key difference between kingdoms that survived and those that vanished, while others note that sheer geographic luck often determined outcomes, as societies located in more stable environments had greater margins for error. Another recurring factor in the downfall of hidden kingdoms was the arrival of outsiders armed with new technologies, ideas, or diseases, because isolation delayed exposure, but also delayed immunity and adaptation, making first contact devastating. In some cases, invading forces did not even recognize the political complexity of the societies they encountered, dismissing them as primitive or fragmented, even as they dismantled systems that had sustained millions of people for centuries. Written records from later empires often minimized or ignored the achievements of these kingdoms, either out of ignorance or deliberate erasure, contributing to their disappearance from mainstream historical narratives. Modern historians are increasingly critical of these sources, arguing that the absence of documentation would not be mistaken for the absence of sophistication. What makes the study of hidden kingdoms so compelling today is not just the mystery of their disappearance, but the uncomfortable parallels with our own world, because the same forces that shaped their fate, environmental stress, economic dependency, political rigidity, and unequal access to resources, remain deeply relevant in the 21st century. By examining how these societies navigated periods of growth and crisis, we gain insight into the fragile balance that sustains any complex system, and why collapse is often not sudden, but the result of slow compounding pressures that go unaddressed for too long. Some scholars suggest that the true tragedy of hidden kingdoms is not that they fell, but that their lessons were lost along with them, leaving future civilizations to repeat similar mistakes. As we move deeper into this story, we will explore specific kingdoms that once ruled vast territories from the shadows, uncovering how they governed, how they interacted with the wider world, and what ultimately led to their decline. Because history is not only written in the rise of famous empires, but also in the silence left behind when powerful societies disappear, and understanding those silences may be one of the most important historical tasks of our time. Into specific patterns of collapse, forgotten rulers, and the long afterlives of these societies, because even when kingdoms disappear from maps, they rarely vanish from history entirely, instead living on through language, customs, myths, and sometimes the political structures of the modern nations that unknowingly inherited their legacy. As historians dig further into archaeological records and reinterpret ancient sources, a striking pattern emerges. Most hidden kingdoms did not fall because of a single catastrophic event, but through a slow erosion of authority that unfolded over generations, often invisible to those living through it, as prosperity masked deepening structural weaknesses. In many cases, elites became increasingly disconnected from the populations they governed, extracting more resources while investing less in public goods like irrigation, food storage, and local security, a dynamic that modern scholars often describe as a tipping point system, where stability appears intact until it suddenly collapses. When this moment arrived, it was often triggered by something seemingly external, a drought, a trade disruption, or a foreign incursion. But the true cause lay in decades of internal strain. Hidden kingdoms were especially vulnerable to shifts in global trade because their power often depended on controlling narrow corridors of exchange, rather than broad territories. And when maritime routes replaced overland ones, or when new powers bypassed traditional hubs, entire economies could unravel almost overnight. Archaeological evidence from parts of Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia suggests once thriving cities were rapidly abandoned after trade declined, not because people vanished, but because urban life itself became unsustainable without external demand. Some experts argue this represents an early form of globalization shock, while others caution that local political decisions often accelerated the damage, turning manageable downturns into irreversible collapse. Military transformation also played a decisive role, as hidden kingdoms that relied on defensive geography or ritual authority struggled to respond to opponents using new weapons, tactics, or organizational models. And by the time rulers recognized the threat, reform was often too late. Unlike expansionist empires that constantly adapted through warfare, many hidden kingdoms had little incentive to modernize their armies during long periods of peace, which created a false sense of security that proved fatal when confronted with highly mobile or technologically superior forces. In some cases, conquest was less about annihilation and more about absorption, as victorious powers integrated these kingdoms into larger imperial systems, preserving local elites while erasing independent sovereignty, effectively ending a kingdom without dramatic destruction. Yet collapse did not always mean disappearance, because many hidden kingdoms transformed rather than fell outright, reshaping themselves into regional identities, religious centers, or cultural networks that persisted long after political authority dissolved. Linguists and anthropologists have traced modern languages, social hierarchies, and ritual practices directly back to these forgotten states, suggesting that, while the kingdom as a political entity vanished, its influence endured in subtler but more lasting forms. This challenges the popular idea that history moves in clean breaks, instead revealing continuity beneath apparent endings, where old systems quietly evolve into new ones. Modern rediscovery has profoundly changed how historians view these societies, because satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and advanced dating techniques have uncovered massive urban layouts, road systems, and agricultural infrastructure hidden beneath jungles, deserts, and modern cities. These findings suggest that some hidden kingdoms supported populations comparable to well-known ancient empires, forcing scholars to reconsider long-held assumptions about where and how complex civilizations could develop. At the same time, debates continue over interpretation, with some experts emphasizing centralized authority, while others argue these kingdoms functioned as flexible networks rather than rigid states, a discussion that reflects broader questions about how we define civilization itself. The political implications of these discoveries are not purely academic, because in several regions, modern nations now claim descent from or connection to hidden kingdoms as a source of legitimacy, identity, and cultural pride. This has sparked renewed interest, but also controversy, as selective interpretations of the past are sometimes used to justify contemporary power structures, territorial claims, or nationalist narratives. Historians caution that while these kingdoms deserve recognition, they should be understood in their full complexity rather than reduced to symbols for modern agendas, reminding us that history is most dangerous when simplified. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of hidden kingdoms is how closely their trajectories mirror challenges facing societies today, as rising inequality, environmental stress, and over-reliance on fragile systems echo patterns that once led to collapse. Some scholars argue that studying these past societies offers a kind of long-term warning system, revealing how resilience depends not on size or wealth alone, but on adaptability, inclusiveness, and the ability to respond honestly to crises. Others note that unlike ancient kingdoms, modern societies possess unprecedented scientific knowledge and global coordination, suggesting collapse is not inevitable, but only if lessons are actively learned rather than admired from a distance. In the end, the rise and fall of hidden kingdoms reminds us that history is not only about those who shouted the loudest or conquered the farthest, but also about societies that chose different paths, built extraordinary worlds in relative obscurity, and left behind traces still waiting to be understood. And by listening carefully to these forgotten stories, we gain not just a richer picture of the past, but a clearer understanding of the forces that continue to shape our future, because every civilization, no matter how powerful or invisible, exists on borrowed time, and what determines its legacy is not how long it lasts, but what it leaves behind.